Hello and welcome to Food Tank's webinar series. This is Sarah Small. I'm Food Tank's Global Events Director. And I'm really excited about today's webinar with Oliver Gottfried, the Senior Advocacy and Collaborations Advisor for the U.S. Regional Office of Oxfam America. And also joining us is Mary Babic. She's the Senior Communications Officer for the U.S. Regional Office of Oxfam America as well. Today their presentation will cover the human cost of cheap chicken and their Lives on the Line campaign. This webinar will be recorded and posted on foodtank.com afterwards. You can also follow along and participate on Twitter using hashtag #FoodTank. Also, Oxfam's hashtag for their campaign, they'll be mentioning later, is hashtag #LivesOnTheLine. Also, please submit your questions using the questions tab in your control panel or email them to me, S-A-R-A-H, that's Sarah, S-A-R-A-H, at foodtank.com, or submit them on Twitter. So without further ado, Oliver and Mary, it's wonderful to have you here today, and I'm excited to hear your presentation. I believe Oliver will be kicking off their presentation this afternoon, so I'll give you the floor now, Oliver.
Great. Thanks, Sarah. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, that's great.
Great. All right, so thanks everybody for joining, and I really want to thank Sarah, Danielle, and Food Tank for giving us the opportunity to come on and present about Oxfam's new campaign, which just launched 3 weeks ago today, actually. We're really excited to tell all of you about the issue of poultry workers and why Oxfam got involved and what we're doing to raise the profile of this issue and spur people to action. So, Mary, if you want to hit the next slide. So as you can see here, Oxfam firmly believes that the booming poultry industry is built on the backs of the most vulnerable workers in the United States. We're going to go through a little bit about how the modern poultry industry is structured and what's its sort of current state of profitability, and what that means for its workforce. The 250,000 people who stand in poultry processing plants all around the country doing jobs exactly like what these men are doing right here, all day, every day, and the conditions that these workers have to suffer through and endure in order to get chicken to our restaurants, our grocery stores, and schools and cafeterias, and to the plates in our homes. And then talk a little bit about what Oxfam is doing to raise awareness with a number of other organizations that we've been working with to raise awareness of what these workers are going through and how we're asking people to get involved. So a little bit about the poultry industry and what's happening. So about 60 years ago, the poultry industry and really a lot of agriculture was very disparate, spread out. It was a lot of very small farms, many small farms with just a very small number of chickens per farm. And we must thank the Pew Center for this graphic, which they included in a report that they did on the environmental impact of the poultry industry many years ago. But as you can see here, it was 1.6 million farms raising just about 300 chickens per farm. Lots of space to move around. And for the most part, when they sold their chickens, they did it just to a local butcher. And so every chicken that you bought was usually raised and sold locally. But just a few years ago, it had completely flipped and became an enormous industrialized operation. You now have just 27,000 chicken farms around the country with an average of over 300,000 chickens per farm. And they work around the clock to raise and breed chickens and give them over to poultry processing plants that then process them around the clock to the tune of, Mary, if you want to flip to the next slide. 8.6 billion pounds of chicken per year, and this is the graph of what poultry production has looked like for the last 64 years or so. And it has really just exploded in growth, and commensurately our consumption of chicken has grown exponentially. And about 20 years ago, chicken became the most popular meat in America, and since then consumption of chicken has only increased while consumption of beef and pork has actually gone down. The average American now eats 89 pounds of chicken each year, and that's expected to continue growing, perhaps not at exactly the same exponential rate that you see here, but still at an extremely high rate. And that, in turn, has changed the way that we process chicken. What you have now is just a few companies that control the majority of the chicken processing in this country. This is an extremely modernized and consolidated poultry industry, to the point where the top company, Tyson Foods, controls almost a quarter of the market by itself. The top 4 companies control almost 60% of the market, and the top 10 companies control almost 80% of the market. And what this means is that if you are really, no matter where you buy your chicken, what restaurants you eat at, what grocery stores you go to, what cafeteria you might eat at, unless you're buying from your local farmer's market, for the most part you are buying from likely one of these 4 companies. And they have tremendous control over the production process and the way this industry works. And their main priority is production, producing and selling as much product as they possibly can in order to return the greatest profit for their shareholders or the people that own them as much as humanly possible. So on to the next slide. Also, what you have is tremendous consolidation. So there used to be a lot of other companies that would buy and sell chicken, but one of the growth strategies that these companies have used is to buy up smaller companies and absorb them into their operations. So while you may buy Weaver chicken nuggets or Hillshire Farm chicken sausage or even Coleman Organic or Coleman Natural Chicken, what you're doing is actually supporting one of these 4 companies. So Tyson Foods now itself owns things like Weaver and Sara Lee and Hillshire Farms. And Purdue, which is the 3rd largest poultry company, owns Coleman Organic and owns Coleman Natural and owns Harvestland. So while you think you may be buying from a company that employs better conditions or treats their chickens better or has safer food, really what you are is still just supporting these top 4 companies. And part of what Oxfam wants to do in this work is to help consumers understand that and understand that you may think that there is a choice when buying chicken, but like many other industries that have become more consolidated over the years, it really is very much the same. So all these changes in production, the growth of these companies, how much bigger they've gotten, how much more product they have to put out, what does that mean for workers? So Oxfam spent the last 2 years putting together the report that has informed what we're going to talk about here in the website that we'll point out to you, and have really found sort of 3 main issues, areas of concern that have propped up. So there are 250,000 poultry processing workers in the United States, and these are the workers who take the live chickens when they arrive at each of the processing plants and help basically turn them into, at the end of the process, the pre-breaded, pre-seasoned, pre-cooked chicken nuggets and chicken strips and other things that you can buy at the grocery store or eat at a restaurant. This is almost entirely a workforce that is minorities and people of color. There are a significant number of immigrants in this industry, and as well a significant number of women. There are not exact demographic numbers for this industry because the federal government in their data collection combines poultry, beef, and pork processing workers together. But anecdotally, we know that it is almost entirely people of color. Maybe a third or more are immigrants, and about half, or if not more than half, are women. And this plays into the unique problems that they suffer, and I'm going to go over them quickly here, and then we'll go over them in a little bit more detail next. These workers suffer incredibly high rates of injury and illness that result in debilitating and lifelong injuries. They are rewarded purely with low wages that are declining in value. And because of these vulnerable populations that make up this workforce, the poultry companies deliberately take advantage of who these workers are to create what we call a climate of fear. So more specifically on these issues, on the next slide, Mary. This is some numbers that came from a survey of poultry workers in Alabama that Southern Poverty Law Center, who's one of our Oxfam's partners, put together several years ago. So what you'll see here is that almost 3/4 of the workers that they surveyed had suffered a significant work-related injury or illness. More than 3/4 of them had suffered cumulative trauma disorders in their hands and wrists. And cumulative trauma disorders are what happens when these workers stand on the processing line while the chickens move by them at incredibly high rates. They basically stand in place for every day for an 8-hour shift with perhaps one 20 or 30-minute break in the middle of that, and all they do is process chickens all day long. These chickens go by at a rate of 35 to 45 chickens each minute, and each worker has one job that they do, whether it's to cut off the wings or to pull off the skin or to pull off the chicken breasts or to cut off the legs. They perform an exact same job over and over and over again every day without a break. And a rough estimate is that these workers do the exact same motion, again, whether it's a cutting motion or a sawing motion or pulling motion, at least 20,000 times a day, and that can be as high as 100,000 times per day. And again, they do not get breaks. These companies do not allow them to stop, stretch, leave the line, even to go to the bathroom, and I'll get to that again in a second. Or be able to stop at their own pace. They are basically pushed to do this exact same job without stopping for about 4 hours. They get a very short break, and then they move on to the next job. And what that means is they start to develop what are called cumulative trauma disorders. That's pain, swelling, numbness, tingling, loss of feeling, loss of grip from their hands, hands and upper body for doing these same motions every day. And again, in this Southern Poverty Law Center survey, 86% of the workers reported hand or wrist pain, and as I said, swelling, numbness, or the inability to close their hands. So if you go to the next slide, you'll see some of the official injury statistics that the government has counted. Oh, let me give a quick, you can go back, Mary. So this is just one example of the kind of problems that these poultry workers suffer. This is a woman named Karina. She worked at a poultry plant in North Carolina, and the Charlotte Observer several years ago interviewed her. She is unable to use the forearms on her hands because of the work in the poultry plant. So she's not able to pick up anything or hold it, and so here she is hugging a child really with her forearms, but not with her hands or her wrists because she's unable to. So looking at some of the specific injury data, this is from the Department of Labor in their annual survey of injuries in the poultry industry. Poultry workers suffer occupational illness cases at 5 times the average of all other workers, and that includes these cumulative trauma disorders like carpal tunnel syndrome. But specifically for carpal tunnel syndrome, they suffer it at 7 times the average of all workers. And carpal tunnel syndrome, the way that it manifests itself for these workers is can be sort of a permanently disabling condition. While a lot of office workers may think of carpal tunnel as pain in their wrists and they wear a brace and they have to be careful about the posture that they use for their computers, for poultry workers, because of the severity of it, it can be a permanent and lifelong disabling condition where they lose the inability to use their hands. And finally, they suffer repetitive strain from microtasks, the tiny little jobs they do in cutting, hanging, and pulling at 10 times the average. And part of the problem that we and many others have uncovered is that the rate of injury that's reported in here is likely severely undercounting the actual rate of injury. Poultry companies deliberately prevent workers from reporting injuries that would show up on surveys like this one from the Department of Labor by discriminating against workers that report injury, harassing workers that report injury, or sometimes even firing workers that report injury. So our contention, and the contention of many others, including some government sources that have surveyed this, is that the injury rates in the poultry industry, official injury rates, likely severely undercount the problem. So on top of these injuries, not only this, but poultry workers suffer from what we believe is woeful compensation. These are not minimum wage jobs, but they are very low wage jobs. These workers average about $11 an hour, which translates to about $20,000 to $25,000 a year. And over the last 30 years, almost 40 years, those wages have declined by 40% in actual value. And as you'll see, the poverty level for a family of 3 is about 20,000, and the poverty level for a family of 4 is about 25,000. So that means even a poultry worker who supports a family of 3 or 4 but works full-time still qualifies for a number of government assistance programs like food stamps, school lunch, Head Start, and a number of others. And so we've heard workers taking advantage of these government assistance or turning to local food banks and pantries, check cashing services, and other things simply because they're unable to afford the day-to-day life. On top of that, these poultry companies are making an enormous amount of money at the time that these workers are suffering from this. The CEO of Pilgrim's, which is the second largest poultry company in the United States, made $9 million just last year in 2014. That's up almost 300% in just 4 years. And he makes, basically in less than a day, he makes the same amount of money that one of his poultry workers will make in an entire year. And their profits and their profit margins are only going up while the real value of these workers' wages is going down. And one of the most illustrative examples we've found is that if you go in and buy chicken McNuggets at McDonald's, for each dollar that you spend on a chicken McNugget, about 2 cents of that dollar goes to the worker in the processing plant. And the rest goes to some of the other costs that they have, and then purely into the pockets of both the CEOs of these fast food companies and the poultry companies. So the last of the 3 areas that we've identified is what we call a climate of fear. And poultry companies will deliberately take advantage of who these workers are in order to create what we call a climate of fear here. So there are constant examples of harassment and discrimination, threats of deportation because many of these workers are immigrants who are here without documentation. There are workers fired. This happens from something as complex as a worker speaking out about a problem that they've seen or dangerous behavior or a food safety concern to something as minimal as a worker slipping and falling because of the slippery conditions. Poultry companies often employ what's called a point system, which is basically a demerit system. Each time they might show up to work late or report a problem or slip and fall, they're given a point. And if they accumulate a certain number of points, then they're fired without explanation. The problem is that the workers don't know what the points policy is because the companies keep it vague and mysterious on purpose. So workers have no idea what gets them a point, how many points they have, how many points it may take until they're fired. And so they basically will never speak out about a problem because they may fear that they're 1 more point away from being fired. Or sometimes the poultry companies will invent other excuses to get rid of them, even though they know that the worker has done nothing wrong. And poultry companies will also deliberately take advantage of the demographics of their workforce to prevent communication among workers or their right to organize. Only about 1/3 of poultry workers are organized into a labor union. Most of those are represented by the United Food and Commercial Workers, UFCW, who's another one of Oxfam's partners in this campaign. But the industry has a history of anti-union behavior. It's been very difficult because many of these companies are located in the South, in right-to-work states, for the unions to be able to grow their membership. And so companies will take advantage of this by deliberately splitting up workers by race so that they're unable to communicate with each other. And what happens is these workers, because they're fired or discriminated against or because they get injured, leave the job. And turnover rates in these plants are extremely high, sometimes as high as 100% a year. And so what's happened is that the industry has been forced to move into newer and more economically vulnerable populations in order to fill these jobs. They really have a severe labor shortage. And so while it used to be low-income African Americans in the South in the 60s and 70s in these plants, then they started to bring in Latino immigrants in the 80s and 90s. And as all of those workers started to become more aware of their rights and to speak out, the poultry companies decided to move on to more and more economically vulnerable populations. They now use workers from indigenous communities in Latin America and South America, people from Southeast Asia and Central Asia, and they use refugee communities where they'll work with refugee resettlement agencies to bring workers in to fill these jobs. And one of the more recent things they've started to use is prisoners, where they'll bus in prisoners from local prisons to fill the jobs on the line, sometimes right next to non-prisoner workers. That's how desperate these companies are. But instead of improving their conditions, they simply move on to the next most vulnerable population to try to exploit. So what's Oxfam doing about this? I'm going to turn it over to Mary, who's our communications officer here at Oxfam America, to tell a little bit about what Oxfam's doing to raise the profile of this issue and engage with consumers and other advocates such as yourselves to get people more in tune about this. Oh, sorry. Yes, Mary, do you want me to touch on this or do you want to?
Yes, if you could, Oliver, that would be great.
Yeah, so we've actually seen, Oxfam as a policy when we campaign against companies, So we have publicly named those top 4 companies that we mentioned as the targets of this public awareness raising effort and campaign that we've launched. So that's Tyson, Pilgrims, Purdue, and Sanderson Farms. We've engaged with each of those 4 in an attempt to have a conversation about the conditions that our research uncovered, and talk to them about ways we might be able to mutually find solutions to address some of these issues. The good news is we've seen a little bit of movement so far from Tyson, who has had a dialogue with us. They have recently announced that they're raising the pay for about 1/3 of their workers, bringing the entry wage for those workers to $10 an hour, and then bumping up some of the workers who made between $10 and $11 an hour. We do not believe this is enough, but we are very pleased that it's been an announcement that they've made recently. And they've also implemented a new health and safety pilot, which they're piloting in a few of their plants. We're still trying to learn about exactly what that pilot is, but we're certainly encouraged that they've started to make some changes in their operations. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA, at the Department of Labor has introduced what's called a regional emphasis program, which means that they will now be paying more attention to the poultry industry. We believe that they have not done enough recently to allow these conditions to persist in terms of not operating proper oversight and investigation of the industry. The U.S. Poultry and Egg Association announced a new ergonomics program, which would deal with some of those cumulative trauma disorders and musculoskeletal disorders that these workers suffer. And members of Congress have become more aware of this as well, and have written letters to OSHA recently asking for them to take more of a look at the industry. So we were very pleased to see that there's starting to become more awareness about this issue, but we do believe we have a long way to go, and that's exactly what we're here to ask for your help in doing. So I'll turn it over to Mary.
Great. Thank you, Oliver, and thanks so much, Sarah and Food Tank, for hosting this webinar for us. So I work very closely with Oliver, and I really love hearing him talk about the workers. He knows an incredible amount about the poultry industry and about the plight of the workers on the line. But when we came to communicating about this problem and about the challenges to the workers and to the industry, we realized that we really needed to hear from the workers themselves. That once you talk to one worker who has experienced what Oliver talked about, particularly some of the health and safety challenges and the way they get injured so quickly and so easily and then basically get disabled, it really strikes at the heart of what all of us care about. So we did produce a big report called Lives on the Line that weighs in at a hefty 48 pages and features charts and graphs and photographs and the history of the industry, but we realized that this really wasn't going to resonate with people in a way that brought it home to them. For one, this had already been documented by some great organizations. So Southern Poverty Law Center and Human Rights Watch did very effective reports about the poultry industry and the problems faced the workers. And the media had also covered it. So there was a great series in the Charlotte Observer in 2008, and LA Times did some great pieces on it as well. And these were great reports, but they just kind of sat there on the paper. So we realized that we really needed to bring the stories, the voices, the faces, the reality of what these people are dealing with. So we saw a number of examples of what are called immersive experience websites that brought all these elements into play, that feature ambient videos with the sounds of what it's like to be on the street listening to the poultry trucks go by, in the plant faced with the really harsh conditions that people have to deal with every day. So we reached out to our creative department and hoped that we could put together one of those immersive experience websites for ourselves. And if you have the chance to go to oxfamamerica.org/livesontheline, you can visit it yourself. I'm not going to pull it up here because it's kind of noisy and it's kind of a lot to navigate, but I hope you can go hear from some of the folks themselves about what they went through. This was a huge undertaking for Oxfam America, and I think it's a great new storytelling device for us. It involved months of travel and doing video and photography and design, and then working with an independent consultant to put together the whole website. We think it's incredibly effective, and we've had a lot of great traffic on our site so far. We're using the usual outlets on social media to get the word out about this, including Twitter and Facebook. We're really reaching out to influentials in the industry, and we're really glad that Danielle Nuremberg and Food Tank have been one of those, along with Michael Pollan and Mark Bittman and some great figures in that area. Our media approach was to do some long and short lead releases to both digital and traditional media outlets, and to place op-eds, particularly regionally where these industries are based. We've had some partnering with Upworthy and some other sites to really spread the word about this. So as Oliver mentioned, we've already gotten some really great impact. We think we are going a long way towards improving the lives of some of these workers. We really feel like the moment was right, that although this story had been told before, there's a whole new awareness about the food chain and about the labor practices in the food industry, and we think we made an impact, and we really hope that it will go on and have more of an impact. So here's some of the media coverage that we got on some of these great outlets, and then we're asking you to help us with this. Please sign the petition. We're hoping to get many, many thousands of folks to sign the petition to bring to the top 4 companies, and share the site and petition with your networks, and also visit our social press kit, which has sample tweets and sample Facebook posts, along with some infographics that have really gone a long way towards spreading the word. So I think, Sarah, that about wraps up our presentation, but we are happy to take questions.
Great. Thank you both, Mary and Oliver. That was really informative. And so we do have some questions from our listeners, and we'll go through as many as possible for the next 10 to 15 minutes. And a reminder to our listeners as well to continue to send those in, and the way to do that is using your chat box on Webinar Jam. Email them to sarah@foodtank.com, or once again on Twitter. So the first question, Oliver and Mary, comes from Rachel. She asks, are there any examples anywhere in the world where meat or food processing employees are treated well or treated better?
Yeah, that's a great question, and sadly the answer to that for the most part is no. And one of the sort of very high priorities in our research was to try to uncover whether there was a company that treated their workers better, or at least lived up to some of the specific recommendations that we call for in our report. And while there are companies that do some things better than others, some of them, unionization rates are higher at some companies than others. Some companies do employ more rigorous controls on occupational safety and health. Some companies are more transparent about how about some of their policies. None of them lived up to what we believe is necessary to treat these workers with the respect and dignity that they deserve. And so the goal of our campaign is to create that company, and then push the other companies to follow them, to celebrate that company for doing the right thing, and then push the other companies to follow their lead, what's called basically the race to the top. And so we want to create that poultry company that we can all feel proud of for supporting, and that's why we're targeting the biggest companies. If Tyson or Pilgrim's, as the largest companies in the industry, make these changes and reap the benefits of more consumer attention and a better, happier, healthier workforce, we believe the other companies will have to follow in order to maintain their market position. But sadly, there are examples in other countries where things are slightly better. Unionization rates are certainly higher in some other countries, and so workers there do have a greater voice. They do have a greater ability to speak out and report problems, but that doesn't necessarily mean that their job is safer, or that they necessarily make a livable wage. So we unfortunately have not found that company yet, and are eager to create that company ourselves.
Great, thank you, Oliver. And the next question comes from Lisa. She asks, what effects will OSHA's new program likely have on the industry, both on business in the poultry industry as well as workers? What will be the limitations?
That's another great question. So an emphasis program basically means that OSHA does two things. It means that they do spend time talking to workers, which is something that they don't always do as part of their as part of their usual remit. And so they are spending more time talking to workers in the industry, educating them about what their rights are, health and safety rights, reporting injuries, whistleblower protections, and things like that. And it also means that that OSHA will be doing more inspections of poultry plants in the industry. Part of the problem is that OSHA is woefully underfunded. They actually have the resources to only inspect 1% of all workplaces in the entire country, not just for poultry, but for all industries, 1% of all workplaces in the country in a given year. And so they're just not able to get into as many of these poultry plants. But what an emphasis program is like this is it means they will be doing more inspections in poultry plants and more education of companies about what their rights and responsibilities are in terms of treating their workers better. So that is a good thing. The detriment is twofold. One is what they announced was only a regional emphasis program, which applies to about 6 or 7 states where there are a lot of poultry operations, but it leaves many other states out. And so we have been pushing them to implement what's called a national emphasis program, which would apply to all states around the country. And these emphasis programs only last for a year and then have to be renewed again. And so it was just announced, so we have until October of next year. But if an unfriendly administration comes in with the next presidential election, there's an opportunity, there's a possibility that it won't be renewed. And so the work that will be achieved in the next year will not be able to continue. So there are benefits and limitations to this emphasis program. We certainly believe it's a step in the right direction.
Great, thank you, Oliver. The next question comes from Thomas. He asks, are you able to estimate how much the cost of poultry would rise if employee conditions were improved as you suggested? And before you jump into the answer, I just also wanted to direct Thomas and anyone else who's interested. Food Tank just hosted an event on true cost accounting this past week, and we have a report out about this on the center column of foodtank.com if you want to check that out. But I'd love to hear your response, both Mary and Oliver, on how the cost of poultry might rise if the workers' conditions improved.
Yeah, so unfortunately that's not something that we have been able to uncover in our research for one very specific reason, which is these companies, these poultry companies, have a very poor record of transparency about their operations. Only 3 of them are publicly traded companies, and so they do publicize some information related to their finances and their operations, which they have to do to their investors. But that means every other poultry company in the country is not publicly traded and does not have to put that information out. And so it's very hard to get any sort of accurate assessment of what the changes that we're recommending are and what impact they would have on the cost of their operations and the cost of chicken. And so what we do know is that there are a number of specific recommendations that we ask the poultry companies to implement in our report that would have no cost to them. Things like setting up a mechanism where workers are consulted about conditions in their plants and have an ability to speak out without fear of retaliation or abuse for speaking out. That is, setting up a system where workers are consulted, whether it's a survey or worker management committees or something like that, would cost the companies no money at all. There are a couple of very simple ways for workers for companies to eliminate some of the health and safety risks. One of them, very simply, is job rotation. If workers do different jobs throughout the day, say they have an 8-hour shift and do 2 hours on one job and 2 hours in a different job that uses a different muscle group, you really lessen some of those repetitive strain injuries that workers suffer. That's another thing, if you rotate workers throughout these different jobs, that basically cost them no money whatsoever. And so there are a number of things. We very specifically came up with recommendations that would have no cost. But there are other recommendations that we include that would have a cost associated with them. But again, because of the lack of transparency from the industry, we aren't entirely sure what that is. And so we're hopeful that a company will partner with us to help us uncover that.
Great, thanks again, Oliver. And this question might be more for Mary's expertise, came in via email. The listener asks, the average consumer probably doesn't think about their meat coming from an animal, let alone the workers who help put it on their table. Does your new immersive website try to tell that story? And what is the best way to communicate the importance of this issue at the dinner table?
Well, we do address whether people want to stop eating chicken or not. So we do have an answer for that, which is basically it's up to you. Some people choose not to eat meat for a variety of reasons. The primary message behind the website and our campaign is that jobs processing animals are part of our economy and that they do not necessarily have to be miserable jobs, which is pretty much what they are right now. That this is vital work and that people can be well compensated and well cared for while they're doing it. I think the reality behind processing right now is such that consumer tastes have shifted so that most people now buy their chicken either cut up into pieces or processed into products like entrees or sausages, whereas just about 30 years ago, most of us bought our chickens whole. Now we buy them all cut up. So that has shifted a lot of the processing work to the factories as opposed to the home. And I think it also indicates sort of consumers' loss of touch both with the labor but also with the aspect that it does come from an animal and that we're responsible for that relationship with that animal. Michael Pollan says that eating has now become one of our primary relationships with nature, and I think a lot of us have just lost that as the products have become more and more divorced from the whole animal that it started with. So again, the focus of our campaign is primarily on the people who do the processing of this work, but I think it does speak to how consumers relate to our food chain.
Yeah, and one of the things I wanted to add to that, Mary put it very well, but you know, one of we reference on the website how these poultry companies have made some very positive announcements recently. Now we'll wait to see how well they implement these, but they have moved towards getting rid of antibiotics in their poultry supply chain and have started to talk about only sourcing cage-free eggs in their operations as well. Those are very small steps, and they're not adequate to address either of those issues, but those have happened because consumers have spoken out and have said, we want the chickens to be treated better, we want our food to be safer. And so we believe that that consumers standing up and saying we want workers to be treated better could be a very inclusive piece of that message as well, and something that the companies would have to listen to. So this industry does not move quickly and it does not move often, but it is starting to move a little bit, and we believe that, as Mary said, the time is right to include workers in the conversation that we're having about where our food comes from.
Great. And our next question comes from Nathan, who is a legislative correspondent for a U.S. senator as well as a young farmer tuning in from Washington, D.C. this afternoon. And he asks, I wonder if there is any federal legislation that could be introduced that could change the situation without endangering the job security of the workforce, example being deportation in the case of unauthorized immigrants.
Yeah, so there are a number of things, and we do call for them, a few of them specifically in the paper version of our report, which Mary mentioned. The PDF is available at the link on your screen. Specifically, obviously, with comprehensive immigration reform that gives many undocumented immigrants a path to citizenship, would remove, one of the barriers that these workers have to being able to speak out, and would remove one of the advantages and power imbalances that these companies have over workers. But there are other specific steps that the government could take, specifically Congress could take, to improve things for these workers. More funding for OSHA would mean that they could conduct more operations, more investigations and better oversight of this industry to uncover the sorts of problems that they do find when they do go in and do investigations. And there have been a number of very egregious violations that they've uncovered recently, but not enough, because we believe that these conditions are persistent across the industry. Congress could also step up and actually create legislation that would mandate slower processing line speeds. As I said, the speed at which these workers have to process chickens, again, about 35 to 40 to 45 chickens per minute, which is a chicken every 2 seconds, basically. They could mandate that. Right now, limits on how fast processing line speeds run are set only by the Department of Agriculture, and they are set only with food safety reasons in mind, not anything having to do with worker safety. So Congress and the administration could act to slow those line speeds down, but in fact they've done quite the opposite. There was a proposal from USDA 2 years ago that would have allowed companies to run their processing line speeds faster, but due to the work of a number of very great organizations, that rule was abandoned, and so that line speed increase did not go through. But we believe that there are a number of things that Congress could do. The last one being increased protection for whistleblowers who do speak out and are retaliated against. Again, our report has more specifics on that, but while we are targeting mostly the industry with our campaign and trying to get these companies to change, we are continuing to advocate in Washington, D.C. for policy and regulatory change that we believe would improve conditions for these workers as well.
Thank you, Oliver. And the next two questions I think are related. So Jennifer asks, do you believe that more unionization within the chicken processors, or sounds like poultry industry, would improve their work environment or wages? And then another listener asks via email, how are unions or groups like the Coalition of Immokalee Workers changing the industry?
So yes, there's no question that if more of these workers were organized into unions, they would be able to bargain collectively for higher wages and safer working conditions in a more powerful way, because there would be more of them. The fact that only a third of the workforce at this point is unionized leaves 2/3 of these workers out, and it means that because the majority of workers are unorganized, they have less bargaining power collectively. So you would have more workers with a very crucial way to speak out through grievance mechanisms and other things that exist for unionized workers. So the labor union is involved in this effort. They've been very much a part of this, and union members have been joining. Poultry worker union members have been joining us at some of our public events and speaking out about this. They believe really what we hope to achieve in this campaign is creating an atmosphere where these companies value their workers more and respect the right, if these workers want to organize into unions, that they do not prevent that from happening. Because what happens now is that these companies actively engage in union avoidance practices. And so we want to create an environment where if the workers want to organize into a union, that the companies do not stand in their way, so that it's up to the workers what sort of action they want to take collectively.
Great, thank you. And then the next question comes from Honor, and she wants to compare the conditions in the U.S. to the EU. So her question is, are conditions significantly better in the EU, and how do you expect the TPP will impact that?
So we don't exactly know what some of these new trade agreements and how that will impact the working conditions. So one of the advantages that we have in this fight is that we do not import any chicken that's from any other country into the U.S. The rules do not currently allow for that to happen, but we do export it, and about 20% of all chicken in this country is exported to other countries, and the poultry industry sees exports to other countries as one of their big growth areas, because as I said, consumption in this country does still continue to climb, but it has leveled off somewhat, and so these companies really see these foreign markets as a tremendous opportunity for them. The European Union is not one of the areas where we export much of our chicken. We do, for the most part, export most of it to Africa and South America and some Asian countries. But we have, again, while there are slightly higher rates or much higher rates of unionization, we have not heard about really good working conditions in some of these European countries or in some other Western Hemisphere countries as well. So we have, again, we looked for better companies not only in the U.S. but around the world as well, and just have yet to be able to identify those conditions in any country, whether it's here or overseas.
Great, and we'll end on this question. So, based on a lot of the statistics that you shared, Oliver, that doesn't look too attractive. And based on the WHO's recent announcement of processed red meat being a carcinogen or probable carcinogen, it seems like poultry consumption will only increase. So, as a consumer and for our listeners today, where is the best place for them to buy and consume poultry if they choose to eat meat? and how can they also support the Lives on the Line campaign from Oxfam.
Mary, you want to handle this one?
Well, I would certainly say I hope everybody has it up on their screen. Please go to the site and sign the petition, and encourage everyone you know to sign the petition, which you can do through the Social Press Kit page, which enables you to share on Twitter and Facebook. We are hoping that we will collect enough signatures to bring to the companies to have an impact. And as for consuming yourself, we all make so many decisions about how we're going to eat. I think a lot of us in the office are now choosing to do some CSAs that deal with meat, particularly chicken, because the more local it is, the more likely it is that it's processed locally, which means they're not done in these big factories that employ these people in these really fast-paced, difficult jobs. Also, while it won't make a huge difference, buying an entire bird and cutting it up yourself will at least give you some insight into what it takes to take these birds apart and actually deal with the reality of their lives and what happens to the workers inside the factories. Oliver, anything to add?
No. No, I think as Mary said, we believe that the way that things can change is for these companies to hear from their consumers and their customers directly, and so that's why we created this petition, and that's why we're asking people to take action with it. And we believe that if they hear from enough people and they get enough pressure, that they will change their conditions, and then we can all have a company that we can. If you do choose to eat chicken, you will have a company that you could support and feel good about. So.
Thank you so much, Oliver and Mary, and I think that's a great note to end on as well. So once again, thank you for joining us today, and thanks to all of our listeners for sending in really great questions. It was truly a pleasure to have all of you here. I have one announcement. Tomorrow we'll be hosting another webinar at noon Eastern. It'll be with Anna LePay, and the topic is the ABCs of the GMO debate. Do we really need GMOs to feed the world? So I encourage all of our listeners to register now on foodtank.com. This webinar was also recorded and will be posted later today on foodtank.com and shared with you. So thank you again to everyone, and have a great rest of your day.
And thank you, Sarah, and thanks to Food Tank for sponsoring the webinar.
Yes, thanks everybody.